Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ellen Shakespeare. I am the program director at the City University of New York School of Professional Studies. Today we're doing our second part webinar of our webinar series, Maximizing Microsoft Excel for HIM Professionals, Transforming Data into Actionable Information. Some of you may recall that we had part one about a month ago, and we will be having a third webinar coming up in about another month. This is the middle number 2 webinar in the series. If you need information on reviewing webinar number 1, please email me. I'll give you my contact information in just a little while. So thank you. Thank you for coming today. Just a little bit about our program here at the City University of New York, or CUNY. We have a BS in HIM program. We are in candidacy with CAHIM, which is the accrediting body for all health information management and health information technology programs. We are a fully online program, and one nice feature is that we have no out-of-state tuition. All students who take our online programs at the School of Professional Studies pay in-state rates, which is a really nice thing. I have a very experienced group of faculty that help me with the HIM program, many of whom are experienced educators in using online education, but in addition they are also experienced practitioners out in their roles as a HIM practitioner. Here is the website for our HIM program. If you would like more information about it, this is how you can find out all the information. A little bit also, we have a new Master's of Science in Data Analytics. This is a little overview of that curriculum. It's total of 12 courses, some core courses, and tools that are used. Here you can see on the screen our approximate cost and the application deadlines for the upcoming semesters. So now I'm going to introduce you to your instructor for the day. It's Mike Gera. Mike did our first webinar about a month ago, and he did a fantastic job. So I would like to turn the mic over to you. Mike has over 30 years of experience in healthcare, and he really knows a lot about Excel. So I'm going to turn the mic over to him. Here you go, Mike.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Michael Gera, and I'm going to be your instructor today. Today we're going to delve into some of the most important aspects of Microsoft Excel, and some of the things that we're going to be doing today focus on some of the lesser used utilities, and those utilities that really can have a major impact on your ability to work with data, to do real important data analysis. And so as we go through today's exercises, I want you to keep in mind, I'm going to show you some techniques, and I want you to keep in mind how you might be applying these examples in your workaday environment, in the environment that you find yourself in. We are going to be talking specifically about the use of Microsoft Excel in the health information management environment. And for those of you that have used Excel for so many years, as I have, we all find that there are many typical things that we use it for. We use it typically for sorting information, for creating charts and graphs, lists. We create lists of everything you could imagine: patients, providers, employees. We are all constantly doing formulas and calculations of one sort or another using Excel. And many of us use various tracking utilities, tracking both people and events using Microsoft Excel. In short, Microsoft Excel is probably the most useful tool of software that we have at our disposal on a day-to-day basis. And many of us use it even for doing things like departmental budgets, where we're analyzing actual versus expected revenues or expenses, We're doing ad hoc data analysis where we're looking at admissions, visits, reviews. All of these things are very helpful. They're very useful. There are many other uses that we use for Excel. But today, we're going to be concentrating on some of the things that you may not necessarily spend as much time working with currently, but you're going to, after I go through some of these exercises, you're going to wonder how you ever used Excel without knowing some of these things. How many times have you heard, we've got to work smarter, not harder? Well, today was meant for you. Today is the day where you're really going to learn how to use Excel so that you can work smarter, not necessarily harder. I'm going to show you how to use certain techniques in Excel which will truly make your life easier and will give you a better control over analysis, of doing real data analysis. So sit back, enjoy. I'm going to take you through in a very structured fashion, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to send those to us. We'll be happy to review all of the email addresses at the end where you can send them. We'll do our level best to answer every one of the questions that get asked as we go through this. Now, these tools that I'm going to show you enable you to work smarter, not harder. Harder are filtering, which I know some of you already use, reports with subtotals and totals, which is kind of like Excel's in-house report writer, if you can think of it that way, and pivot tables, and specifically pivot tables and pivot charts. We're going to be talking about all of these utilities today. We're going to spend a fair amount of time going through each one of them. I've prepared a number of exercises for you that I'll go through in a very deliberative way. You'll be able to follow those exercises, and as we go through them, I'll emphasize certain aspects of each tool. So understand that as we go through, these tools that we're about to use help to turn raw data into actionable information. Now, what do I mean by actionable information? Well, I simply mean information that's used for decision making. I think most of us know that raw data really doesn't have a life unto itself. It really doesn't always tell us anything. We have to put some interpretation behind it. We have to be able to look at the data, maybe express it in a summary fashion, or perhaps graph it to be able to understand what the trend is and what the usefulness of it is. But today, these three tools, filtering, reports with subtotals and totals, and pivot tables and pivot charts, really enable you to use Excel for what it was meant to be used for. That is to say, analysis. All right, let's begin by using filtering. And before we get going on this, so I want to go over a couple of little ground rules. But first of all, I want to say one thing about filtering. What filtering enables us to do is to select data specifically for predetermined criteria that we as users will create. So another way of thinking about filtering is to think about how you would go about becoming a computer programmer. Now, that's not to say you're going to become a computer programmer today, but much of the thinking that we use in filtering is very similar to the type of logical thinking that a computer programmer will use. So I want you to think about that as we go through this, how you would structure your information, how you would structure your spreadsheets in a way to enhance the use of filtering. Now, there are a couple of basic important filtering concepts that I want to mention, and I'm going to come back to these again and again today. First of all, I want to mention that we want to make sure that we have no blank columns and no blank rows. You'll see what I mean by this. The effect of blank columns and blank rows will certainly have a negative impact on the data that we're trying to analyze. So I find that it's frequently best to try to minimize how many blank columns or blank rows we've got. Remember, what we're trying to do is strive for data consistency. If our data is consistent, our reports will be consistent. We can combine filtering with other tools, and we'll demonstrate some of that, and we'll talk about how you can format columns when filtering data on dates, filtering data on numeric, on currency, any one of a number of things. So these are some things that we'll be going through as we go through these exercises. I'll come back to these concepts. We'll mention them before we go too far along. Now, the first thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to bring to your attention the spreadsheet. This spreadsheet that we're going to be working with today has many sub-spreadsheets, has many worksheets underneath. And one of the things that I'm going to be doing is, as we go through the exercises today, I'm going to mention certain things that I think you should keep in mind. Now, you'll notice when we are working with this data that I've created two spreadsheets on this one exercise here. The one at the top, the one that I'm highlighting that you will probably appear in green to you, is nice, clean data. It's data that where we have no blank rows, no blank columns. You'll see that my column headers are very clear. They're stated easily. It's very unambiguous. It's not hard to know what it is that I meant when I went through each one of these. Conversely, if you look at the data at the bottom, what do you see here? You look at this data here, and right in the middle of the data, there is a blank column. Now, this blank column may seem innocuous enough, but when we go to analyze the data, when we go to filter our data, when we go to do a pivot table, when we go to do any reports with subtotals, this blank column can cause us a lot of problems, which is why I want you to remember that as we go through these exercises, the thing that I want you to do is make sure that you array your data. You set your data like this, not like what you see here. Remember, no blank columns, no blank rows. Enough said about that. We'll be coming back to this concept again and again as we go through today's exercise. Well, the next thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to acquaint you with the data that we're going to be working with. I'm going over to exercise 2 at the bottom. I'll make it slightly larger so that everybody's able to see the data. And you'll notice that going across, I've got my data, my columns up at the top. I've calculated a patient age and the length of stay here. The red and the blue really have no real meaning. I just simply put them in there as a teaching tool to be able to draw your eye to them. I'm collecting the patient's name, which frequently we don't really need, their date of birth, what their age is based upon their date of admission, their medical record number, and so forth. So this is the data, or various subsets of the data, that we'll be working with today. You'll notice on the right, I've selected, for no particular reason, patients who have had coronary artery bypass graft surgery. And I've put in the CPT codes here, along with the CPT descriptions. So this is basically a list of patients who have been seen by a surgical practice, and they've all had cabbage surgery of one sort or another. We'll be going through this, and you'll see this. We'll be coming back to this data. So familiarize yourself with this. You'll be seeing it. You'll become more familiar with it as we go along. All right, let's get right to business here. I want to begin by talking about filtering. And again, you see the data here. That's the data that I've been acquainting you with thus far. And what we'll be doing is, as we go through this data, you'll notice that certain things, the appearance of the screen, will change in certain cases. What will happen as we go through as I apply the filters, you're going to see drop-down menus, and those drop-down menus are going to be very useful. Those drop-down menus will allow me to go in and make certain data selections. Now, here we go. I'm going to go to the top. I'm going to click on the file that says data, and then I'm going to click on this little icon that looks like a funnel. And in fact, that is sort of what we're going to be doing. It says filter. I'm going to click on that, and notice what happens. The first thing that you'll notice is that you have down arrow keys at the top of each one of my columns, even with my dates, my length of stay, my surgeon, and so forth. By setting my filter on, this is going to allow me, the presence of these drop-down arrows is going to allow me to select data and go in and select data based upon whatever particular criteria that I want. I'll be able to select data by dates if I want, by the name of the surgeon, by the CPT code or the description, even things like whether or not the patient has had an infection or whether or not the patient expired. We'll be able to do all of these things as we go through filtering. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to exercise number 4. Now that I've acquainted you with the concept of turning that filtering on. Remember, to turn it off, I simply click on filter. If I want to click it on again, I click data, filter, and that will turn the down arrow keys on. That will enable me to do my selection. Now I'm going to go over to exercise 4 at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to click on that. Again, the data is exactly what we've been looking at up to this point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my filtering on. I'm going to click data, filter, and I'm going to maybe make some of these a little bit wider, and so forth. The first thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to filter and I'd like to look at just my patients based upon their date of admission. I'm going to click the down arrow key. I'm going to say I want to be able to examine based upon certain date filters, and I'm going to say I want to look at all of the patients whose date of admission was between 2 specific dates. And in this case, I'd like to look at all of the patients who were admitted between January 1st, 2013 and February 28th, 2013. Notice that the clause here says the date of admission is after or equal to January 1st, 2013. This is what I put in. And is before or equal to February 28th, 2013. I could have used it selecting my calendar here if I would like to, or I can simply type the data in, my data points. I can then click OK, and notice what happens. I now see that 3 of my patients were admitted between January 1st, 2013 and February 28th, 2013. Let's suppose I'd like to expand that range. If I click on my filter again, I click on date filter, I click on between, and let's suppose I now say I want to look at all the patients between 11/01/2012 and February 28th, 2013. I now have changed the filter. So basically what I've done here, ladies and gentlemen, is I've gone in using my filtering tool and said, only show me a certain range of the data. Only show me a certain criteria based upon what I have put in. And in fact, if you look over here, you'll see that not all of my rows appear. Why don't all of my rows appear? Well, my rows don't appear. They don't all appear because not all of the patients qualified based upon the criteria that I met. In fact, you'll notice on the lower left-hand side that 9 of 21 records were found that met this particular criteria. So again, to be able to create the date of admission, I'm going to simply let me turn this off and then I'll turn it back on. I click my filtering icon that restores all of my data to the beginning. I now click on data, filter. I'm going to go to the date of admission, and I'm going to apply my date filters, and I'm going to say between 11/01/2012 and February 28th, 2013. I then click OK, and it shows me just that range of information. I can turn my filtering off, and that will return everybody to me once again. Now, let's suppose I'd like to be able to filter my information based upon who the surgeon was. Well, let's go over to the next exercise. If I click on Filter by Surgeon, I then click on, at the top, just as I did before, Data, Filter. I then go over to the surgeon's name, column J. I click my down arrow key. I click Select All off so that I can look at all of the doctors, all the surgeons who had patients during this time period. And if I say I want to look at Dr. Alan Forrest and for Dr. Alan Forrest's patients, I just check the box next to his name. I then click OK, and notice what the system did. What Excel did, it then went in and teased out of the information. It is showing me, it is displaying just the patients for Dr. Alan Forrest. All the other patients are still there. They're merely hidden from my view. Why? Because they don't qualify on the basis of this particular filter. If I'd like to add another surgeon, I simply go back to my surgeon filter. And then let's suppose I also like to look at Dr. Susan Hernandez's patients along with Dr. Alan Forrest's. I check the box next to Dr. Susan Hernandez. I click OK, and now I can see the patients from both of these surgeons. Maybe they're in the same group, maybe they're not, but now I'm looking at all of the patients for Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Forrest. If I want to look at all of the patients once again, I simply turn my filtering off. I click my little funnel icon at the top, my drop downs are gone, and now I see all of the patients based upon that were there originally. So you can see that filtering is very, very powerful. And this is what I meant by saying that it makes you kind of think like a programmer, because programmers have to be brutally logical in their thinking when they're applying the logic that a user wants in order to be able to retrieve specific data. They have to have a very high level of attention to the detail, and they've got to be able to look and examine the data based upon some sort of a mathematical or an algebraic formula. And that's exactly what filtering does. Now let's go see where filtering can be applied to more than one field. If I go to exercise 6 down below, you'll see where it says filter by admittent date and surgeon. I then will do what I've been doing all along. I go to my top, I click my top row, I click data, filter, and now let's suppose I want to get all of the patients for a particular date of admission and all of the patients for a particular surgeon. That is to say, I want to apply my filtering to 2 different columns. Well, that's easy enough to do. With my filtering on, I can say, show me all of the patients who were admitted using my date filter between, and I'll use the logic that I've been using all along, 11/01/2012 and February 28th, 2013. Once I've done that, I then click OK, and notice what happens. It is showing me 9 of 21 records based upon this criteria, but it's showing me all of the surgeons. Let's suppose I only wanted to look at Dr. Blake and Dr. Aaron Singer's patients who were admitted during this time period. So now I'm going to simply click on the down arrow key next to surgeon. I'm going to click on select all, and I'm going to say display Dr. Thomas Blake and display Dr. Aaron Singer. I click OK, and now you can see that what I'm doing is I'm selecting 5 records of 21, 5 records of 21 found, and I'm selecting based upon the date of admission, and I'm selecting based upon the name of the surgeon. At any point, I can always turn off my filtering simply by clicking the filtering icon one time, and that will then bring me back to show all of my data. Now, people frequently ask me, can I take the results of a filter and copy them to a separate worksheet? And my response is simple. Yes, of course you can. But I would say, why bother? Why bother going through the process of doing that? Because what inevitably will happen is that your spreadsheet will get so busy and you won't remember what the criteria were for each individual selection, which is why I like to keep all of my data in one location, and then I simply apply the logic. So again, filtering by admission date and surgeon, I'm going to turn on my filter. I'm going to go and apply for the date of admission using my date filter, using my between clause, all of the patients who were seen from November 1st, 2012 through February 28, 2013. I then click OK, and there I am displaying my 9 records of the total of 21. And of course, you could do this for as many fields as you want. If I said I only want to see this group of patients who had an infection, I could go in and say yes, select just the patients with an infection, or if they expired, or if they had a particular length of stay. I can do a lot of things with filtering, but the thing to remember is that it's very easy to turn filtering off. All I simply do is I move my cursor inside my data, I click my filtering icon, and now you will see the entire range of data that we originally started with. You're really limited only by your imagination and by which fields you've taken the trouble to include in the spreadsheet as to how you draw data down and how you set your criteria. So in summary, filtering is a very powerful tool. It's one of the most overlooked tools, and I think that if you begin to play around with it, if you begin to try to use it, you'll find that it really does make a lot of sense. You'll be able to work with it, and it will not take you very long to get used to using filtering. Our next topic is one that's near and dear to my heart. Our next topic is the whole topic of reports, and most people don't realize that within Excel there is a built-in report writer. So what I've done is I've gone down to exercise worksheet number 7 here, reports, and I'm going to show you how we can go about creating a report. Let's suppose I wanted to know the average length of stay for all of the patients based upon which surgeon they had. Well, I can do that very easily. It's actually a 2-step process. The first thing that reporting with subtotals is going to require me to do is to sort the data based upon the key field that I'm interested in, my primary key field, which in this case is going to be the surgeon. So I'm going to sort the data. I go to the top, I click Data, Sort, and I'm going to sort by the name of the surgeon. I find the field called Surgeon down below. I select it. I then click OK, and notice what the system did. It then took that data and it sorted the data by surgeon. So now I'm ready to begin creating my report. And the question that I want to ask is, how many patients did each surgeon have? Well, that's easily done. That's easily you can see that. I can almost count it just visually. I can see that Dr. Blake had 5 patients, and Dr. Forrest Allen had 5 patients. No, I guess Dr. Blake had 6, excuse me, and so on and so forth. It's pretty easy to determine. But in your spreadsheets may be much more complicated. Your spreadsheet, your list of patients may go on for hundreds or even thousands of names. And so we want to be able to get to that information very quickly. So what I've done is I've prepared exercise 8 down below. You'll see exercise 8. And what we're going to do is we're going to do we're going to use the reports with subtotals command. First, we're going to sort our data. I click on Data, Sort. I'm going to sort the data by surgeon. So now I've got all of Dr. Blake's patients together, all of Dr. Forrest's patients, all of Dr. Hernandez's patients, and all of Dr. Singer's patients. All right, so now the question becomes, how many patients did each surgeon see? Well, there's a very easy way of doing this. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see an icon that says Subtotal. I'm going to click on that once and watch what happens. When I click on that, it's going to give me some options. The subtotaling feature is going to give me some options that are actually quite ridiculous if you think about it. It's saying to me, do I want to change? I want a subtotal at each change in the patient's last name, and I want to do a count of how many expired. Well, no, that's not at all what I would like to do. What I'd like to do is I'd like to say at each change in surgeon, so I'm going to change this first field to at each change in surgeon, I still want to do a count, but instead of counting the number of patients who expired, I want to count the number of surgeons. I then click OK, and notice what it did. The Excel went in and it told me for Dr. Thomas Blake, he had 6 patients. Dr. Alan Forrest had 5 patients. Dr. Susan Hernandez had 7 patients. And Dr. Aaron Singer had 3 patients. And so with this utility, with this subtotaling ability, I'm able to go in and I'm able to quickly, by sorting the data first, I'm able to quickly do some basic counts using the subtotaling routine. If I want to return to my original data, I simply click on the subtotaling icon. I then click Remove All, and it will then bring me back to where I originally was. Let's review that again. I'll show you how I did it. The first thing that I did was I said sort. What did I sort on? I sorted by the surgeon's name. I then click OK. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to then go up. I look to make sure that all of Dr. Blake's patients are together, all of Dr. Forrest's patients are together, and so forth. I then click on subtotal, and I say at each change in surgeon, count this number of surgeons. I then click OK, and then lo and behold, you can now see that. You can see the actual physical counts. That's a lot better than inserting a bunch of formulas, rather inserting a bunch of lines, doing a couple of formulas, and of course if you had hundreds of doctors, that would be very tedious. One other very important thing that I'd like to point out to you with regard to filters are these 3 little numbers to the left of column A. You'll see a number 1, a number 2, and a number 3. Watch what happens when I click on the little number 1. It shows me simply the grand count of the total number of patients who were in my database in total. If I click on the tiny little number 2, it will give me a summary. It will tell me how many patients each one of my doctors had, plus what the grand total is of all of them. And if I click on number 3, it will then return me back to my original the report that I would like to display, which displays very specifically how many patients how many cases each surgeon had. In order to turn this off, I simply click on subtotal and I click on Remove All. And that will then remove everybody from that particular, it will remove the report parameters, and it will allow me to do whatever calculations I'd like. Now, suppose I'd like to create a report that calculated the average length of stay. I don't want to know the total length, the total number of accounts, or the total number of cases each doctor had. What I want to know is what their average length of stay is for each surgeon. So what I do is I go to my exercise 8. I have to make sure that I've sorted the data by surgeon. Data, sort by surgeon. And now, watch what happens. When I click on my subtotal, I then say at each change in surgeon, we're going to keep that okay. We're going to leave that alone. But what we're going to do is we're going to say, I want to calculate an average of not the surgeon, but the average of the length of stay. I then click OK, and lo and behold, look what it did. It gave me the average for each one of the doctors. It gave me the average length of stay for his or her patients. And if I want to see a summary of this data, I simply click on that tiny little number 2 in the left-hand side, and it will show me the average length of stay for each one of the doctors. If I click number 3, it's going to show me all the data that I want. If I want to return and I want to take the subtotaling off, I simply click subtotal, remove all, and it brings me back to where I was before. I'm going to show you a couple of more examples of the average length of stay. We just did that one. I'm going to now show you how we can create this data. We can sort the data by month and report the data by month and year of discharge. Now look what I've done here. I've gone to exercise 10 down below. make it slightly larger so that you can all see it. And what I've done here is I've added this column. I've added column I. And the reason I've added column I to my data is because I don't want to look at every individual date of admission. But what I'd rather do is I'd like to group the data by month. So show me all the September cases together, all the October cases together, all the November cases together, and so forth. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to now say data sort. We're going to sort by month and year of discharge. So I've now got all that information there. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to click on subtotal, and I say at each change in month and year of discharge, what do I want to do? I want to sum up the patients based upon their month and day of discharge. I then click OK, and I can now see how many patients were seen in each group. Let me do that exercise again. I'm going to turn my filtering off. I'm going to turn my subtotal off, remove all, and I'm going to say subtotal at each change in month and year of discharge. This time I want to average the length of stay. Watch what happens when I click OK, and it's now going to tell me what the average length of stay for each one of the months is. If I want to look at the total by each month, I simply click on that tiny little number 2 off to the left, and you can see the averages and displayed in column J. If I want to look at all my data at the same time, I simply click on the tiny little number 3. It will show me all my data. If I want to remove my subtotaling, I simply click on the subtotaling icon and I click remove all. So there you have a good idea of how to manipulate date data using the reports with subtotals. I now want to show you how you can do a few other things. I want to mention to you that you can sort the data. If I wanted to sort it by CPT code, I could click on sort, and I'm going to sort by CPT code. And so now I've got all my CPT 3510s up above, and 11, 12, and so forth. And now if I wanted to do a quick count of all my cases by CPT code, I could now click on where it says subtotals at each change in CPT code. Let's do a count. And what are we going to count? We're going to count the CPT code. I click OK, and now I can see that for each one of my CPT codes, this was the distribution of cases. Do you have any if you have any questions about those, please send them to us. We'll be happy to answer all of those questions, and don't hesitate to send any of them to us. All right, we are now getting to the point where I would like to give you a summary. I'd like to go into the next topic, which is pivot tables. I'm going to go to the bottom where it says exercise 11, and we're going to talk a little bit about why doing a pivot table. Why would you want to do a pivot table? And this is one of the sort of a little bone I have to pick with Microsoft, because they use this term, a pivot table, and I think that term sometimes unnecessarily scares people because they don't know what a pivot table is. Most of the people in the HIM field that I've worked in don't know what a pivot table is, but they certainly know what a crosstab is. They certainly know what a summary table is. And in fact, pivot table is sort of like a Microsoft term for what most people in healthcare would refer to as either a crosstab, or they would refer to it as a summary table. What a pivot table allows us to do is it allows us to go in and create a summary table of all of the data, and after we've created the summary table of the data, we can then drill down into each aspect of the data. So you'll notice here, for example, what I've done is I've created two new fields. I've got the sex of the patient and I've got the race of the patient. And let's suppose I now would like to be able to create a table that will show us, it will enable us to count how many patients of each gender and each racial identity were seen in this particular group of patients. Well, this is really easy. What we're going to do is I'm going to click on at the top, I'm going to click on where it says Insert, and then if you notice on the left-hand side, you'll see an icon that says Pivot Table. And I'm going to point out a couple of things about this as we go through. I'm going to do this pivot table, and the first time I do it, you may feel a little bit confused. It may feel a little bit odd. I'm going to stop after I do it the first time. I'm going to then start it again. I'm going to do the exercise again. I'm going to show you how to do a pivot table a second time. I'll then stop that, and then after I've done that, I'll show it to you a third time. It won't take more than maybe 5 minutes or so, but I think when you see that a couple of times, it will begin to make sense. Don't feel badly if you don't get it the first time. A lot of people don't. A lot of people don't really understand this concept of pivot table, but once they start using it, they really begin to adopt it for many aspects of their own internal data analysis. So, getting back to the question at hand, I want to know how many patients of each sex and each race are included in this particular group, this particular data set. Remember, no blank rows, no blank columns. I've got a nice tight data set there. So I'm now going to go to my Insert command. I'm going to then click Pivot Table, and notice what happens. The pivot table is going to ask me to select a table or range, but it's going to suggest that my data resides in A1 through P22. Now you may be wondering, why in the world did it know? How in the world did Excel know that that was where I wanted to select my data? Well, it comes down to something very simple. No blank columns, no blank rows. Something else that I'd like to just point out to you that we'll be covering at the next webinar that we are going to do in June is that when you're doing a pivot table, you can actually access external data. You could go out and pull data from a payroll system, from a lab system, from an imaging system, from a billing system. So you're not always beholden to what you have actually manually input, or maybe what you have downloaded from your finance department or from an abstracting system or what have you. You can go in and pull data down using an external data source that is outside of Excel. We'll be coming back to this in a few moments, but I want to proceed. All right, so my data is going to come from this table, from A1 through P22. And you'll notice that the data is already, there's a dotted line running around the perimeter of my data. Excel is basically saying to me, hey Mike, this is the data that I think you want to analyze, and Excel would be right. I then click on OK, and this is the part that gets a little bit confusing sometimes. Notice, I'd like your eyes to focus on this side of the screen. The data over on the left side will eventually populate, but this is where we're going to be making those critical decisions about what this table is going to look like. So I said, well, I want to be able to take the patient's sex up here on in that field list. I want to take that and I want to make that my column label. I then want to take the patient's race, and I'm going to click and I'm going to drag and I'm going to make that my row label. And then I'm going to go back to the patient's sex. I'm going to click and drag that down to this white box that you see down below called values. I then release, and notice what it does. It says count of sex, and lo and behold, look what I've done here. I've now created a pivot table, and this pivot table shows me that in this subset of 21 patients, 8 were male, 13 were female, and it shows me the race distribution between Asian, Black, Other, and White. So there is an example of a very simple pivot table that I've done. I'm going to do it again so that you feel very comfortable with it. And then if you have any questions, by all means, let us know. I'm going to go back to exercise number 11. I'm going to click on Data, Insert, Pivot Table. It will then say to me, Mike, your data is in between cells A1 through P22. We're going to then click OK. I'm going to take the patient's sex, make that my column label. I'm going to take the patient's race, make that my row label. And I'm going to take the patient's race and put that here in the value. This is the Greek letter sigma. Basically, it is the symbol for summing, and it's going to enable me to go in and count for race. And if you look on the left side of your screen, you'll see that what we've done here is we've created a nice table here. A nice summary table. So this is giving me summary data of all of the patients in this data set, and it shows me the distribution of this data in a very meaningful sort of a way. One of the most useful things of pivot tables is when we start looking at things like, for example, chart review. Let's go to the example 12. I prepared example 12 down below, and what I've done here is I've created a field called the length of stay in column I, and the length of stay is based on what? H2 minus F2. The date of discharge minus the date of admission is going to determine what the patient's length of stay is. I'm doing a calculation. And now over here on the right side of the screen, in column K, you're going to see a series of yes and no's. Well, what have I done here? I've simply created some criteria for whether or not we're going to be pulling this chart for a review. If you look very carefully at cell K2 and you look at the formula in the upper left-hand corner, you can see, my friend, the if statement. And this is very, very useful. If you don't already know how to do the if statement, I'm going to show you very quickly here, and then you should try it on your own. The if statement lets you set up particular conditions that apply to this data set. So notice what happens is when I put in my formula, I type in equal if, open parentheses, I2 is greater than 3, give me a yes. Otherwise, give me a no. So what the if statement is basically saying here is if I2 is greater than 3, and what is I2? It's the length of stay for the first patient. If it's greater than 3, give me a yes for chart review. Otherwise, that second comma, can basically be interpreted as otherwise. So, reading my formula from left to right, if I2, the length of stay, if I2 is greater than 3, yes. Otherwise, no. And so what I'm doing here, ladies and gentlemen, is I'm going to go and put together a pivot table based upon whether or not this chart is going to be reviewed. And we'll do that based upon who the surgeon is. So I go to the top, I click on Insert, I click on Pivot Table. It then tells me where it thinks I want to pull this data from. I then click OK. I'm going to now take this concept of chart review. That's now a field that appears in my pivot table field list. I take chart review and make that my column label. I'm going to now take the surgeon's name and make that the row label. I'm now going to do a length of stay analysis for these patients. I'm going to, actually, you know what, let's do this. Let's do a count. I want to do a count and see how many charts had to be reviewed by each surgeon. And lo and behold, look what it tells me. I create my summary table here, and it shows me that for Dr. Thomas Blake, 1 patient did not need to be reviewed, 5 patients did need to be reviewed. For Dr. Alan Forrest, 1 patient did not need to be reviewed, 4 patients did, for a total of 5 patients. Now, one of the great things about a pivot table is that if I want to drill down, let's suppose I want to look at Dr. Alan Forrest's 4 patients who needed to have a chart review. If I go to the number 4 in my pivot table and I double click, watch what's going to happen. I double click, and lo and behold, down here the computer produced another sheet, and that sheet was based upon what? It was based upon the criteria that I set earlier. I'll do this again. I'll give you another example of this, and then what we'll do is you can try a few on your own. I go to exercise 12. I say, well, how am I deciding whether to review a chart? And the way I'm doing that is based upon the length of stay. If the length of stay is greater than 3, yes, review it. Otherwise, that's what that second comma means. Otherwise, no, don't review that chart. So now if I want to do a quick count of how many charts are going to be reviewed, I can now say insert, pivot table. It confirms for me what the range of data is that I'd like to take. I then click OK. I'm going to now take my chart review is going to be my column label. The surgeon is going to be the row label. And I'm going to count, based upon each surgeon, how many patients had the chart review criteria established. And we can clearly see that 15 of the patients, 15 of 21, had the chart review criteria established. So we probably want to look at these. If I wanted to look at all 15 of these patients, that's very easy to do. I simply double click on the 15, and it will now find those patients down right here. It creates another spreadsheet, and it will display those patients right here. So there we have the pivot table with a chart review. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to show you a pivot table using the patient age. What we're going to do is we're going to calculate a pivot table based upon the patient's age. And notice what I've done here. I've created a categorization in column K. I'm creating a categorization of the patients based upon their age. And how did I do this? Well, this is a real live example. This actually came, of course the patients aren't real, but the concept is real. This came from one of my clients who's a nurse, and she said, well, you know, when I run my age analysis, what I'd really like to do is I'd like to divide the group up into a couple of subsets. Those patients who are from 0 to 17, the patients who are we would call pediatric. Then I want to divide my adult group into various groups, various cohorts, 18 to 30, 41 to 50, 31 to 40, and so on and so forth. Well, in order to accomplish this, ladies and gentlemen, what I have to do is I have to use something that's called the nested if statement. Now, you're probably looking at this up at the top and seeing, oh, there's no way, you're probably saying to yourself, there's no way I could ever do that. Well, it really isn't nearly as difficult as it seems. I'll explain it, and then you can play around with it yourself. We've already seen the if statement one time before. We saw it in relation to whether or not the chart is going to be reviewed. In this case, we're trying to divide our group of patients up based upon what? Their age. So look at what the if statement tells me. It says if D2, which is the age of my first patient, if D2 is less than 18, return 0 through 17. Otherwise, if D2 is less than 31, return the value 18 to 30. Otherwise, if D2 is less than 41, then return the values 31 through 40, and so on and so forth. It goes all the way up. So this entire expression is my if statement. And when you see all these all these parentheses at the end that are in different colors, you'll understand that when I'm creating an if statement, whenever I open up a parentheses, as I did here, and as I did here, and as I did here, whenever I open up a parentheses, I must close the parentheses. Otherwise, it's going to give me very strange results. So if I look at this data, I can quickly see that Victor Brown is 11 years old, so the system will calculate him to be 0 to 17. Ellen Carter is 26 years old, so we'll put her in the cohort 18 to 30, and so on and so forth. So what I'm now going to do is we're going to create a pivot table, and we're going to create a pivot table using these categories here, using the surgeon and the patient age as our categories. I'm going to click on Insert, Pivot Table. You can see the entire range from A1 through K22. I then click OK. I'm going to now take this patient age category. I'm going to make that my column label. I'm going to take the surgeon's name. I'm going to make that the row label. And then I'm going to use the patient age again, and I'm going to bring it down to the values, and we're going to do a count. We're going to count how many individuals from each group fell into the various cohorts: 0 to 17, 18 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, and so on and so forth. If I want to look at any one single group, let's suppose I want to look at Dr. Thomas Blake's pediatric patients. He's got 4 of them there. I double click on the 4, and I can now get down to his particular patients specifically. So what I'm doing here, ladies and gentlemen, is when I'm creating my pivot table, I'm setting up my criteria so that the patient age will be the factor that I'm going to use in setting up this data. Let's suppose in another case, let's suppose I had put in the patient's wrong birth date. If I put in the patient's date of birth, and I'm doing a calculation based upon the date of birth, let's suppose I say that Victor Brown was really born on October 5th, 1975. Well, now, lo and behold, he will go from age, age 11 to age 37, and now what will happen is I will then have changed his category from 0 to 17 to patient age 31 to 40. So what I'm able to do, ladies and gentlemen, is I'm able to, with this nested if statement, and you'll see examples. When you get your copy of the spreadsheet, you'll see examples of this. I would try it on your own. Try it using perhaps exercise 12 that I've given you here. A very simple if statement. Remember, what this if statement tells me is it says if I2. What's I2? I2 is the length of stay. If the length of stay is greater than 3, say yes to the column chart review. Otherwise, say no. So now if I want to do another pivot table, I simply click on Insert, Pivot Table. It confirms for me what the range of data is that I'd like to analyze. I click OK. I'm going to now take my chart review. That's going to be my column label. I'm going to take my surgeon. That's going to be my row label. And I'm going to count the number of charts that need to be reviewed, and it will then, over on the left-hand side, create a very nice pivot table that I can drill down to if I'd like to. One of the other things that's really great about pivot tables is that in addition to creating this summary table here, you can also very quickly and very easily create a chart. I simply move my cursor anywhere inside this pivot table, and if you see this icon on the upper right hand side that says Pivot Chart, you'll click that once. You'll select a type of chart that you would like to display. In this case, I'm going to display a bar chart. I then click OK, and lo and behold, I can now see the chart that I've created here that shows me how many charts have to be reviewed for each patient, and I can see on the right hand side, I can see a legend. I can quickly see the legend, and this tells me exactly what I'm doing and exactly what my data looks like in a pictorial form. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think that you can really see that that's true when we're working with pivot tables. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start exercise 14 again with the pivot table. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, what I want to display, what I want to demonstrate for you now is the technique that you will use. Instead of displaying a frequency count, sometimes you're going to want to display the data as a percentage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, and let's suppose I want to look at the percentage of my patients by surgeon that had an infection. Not the frequency count, but the surgeon. Well, that's easily enough done. I click on at the top, Insert, Pivot Table. It confirms for me where the data is coming from. I then click OK. I then will take the surgeon's name, and that will become my row label. I will take whether or not the patient had an infection. That will become my column label. I will then take the infection, bring that down to the values. But now, do you see what it's doing up here? It's displaying the frequency count, but I want to display the percentage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this down arrow key to the right of the count of infection in my values box. I click that once. I click on where it says Value Field Settings. I'm going to select this tab that says Show Values As, and I'm going to do percent of grand total. I'm going to format that as percentage, 0 decimal places. I then click OK and OK. And look, lo and behold, look what happens. It now shows me that 38% of the patients had an infection. But who's in trouble here? It looks like Dr. Blake and Dr. Forrest are not so much in trouble, but Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Singer seem to have higher percentages for infections. It sure would be nice to also have the frequency count so I can tell whether there are enough cases for this to even be meaningful. So I'm going to take my infection again from my field list. I'm going to bring it down to the value section. I'm going to then display that as a percentage. And in fact, I can change my column headers here. I can say percent, and I can say frequency, and it will change it all the way through. And so I can now look at my data, and one of the things that I notice when I look at my data is that for each one of the patients who had a infection under yes, 4 of the patients were Dr. Hernandez's. So indeed, it does look like she has a problem. She is 33% of our total mix, our total list of patients, but yet she had 33% of the infections, and she had in total 7 patients. If I want to look at these 4 patients who had an infection that were on that were patients of Dr. Susan Hernandez, I can then double click on this 4, and it will then produce a sheet for me that has the percentages. So you can create a pivot table that does both percentages, frequency counts, and percentages, or you can do just one or the other. What I'd like to do is I'd like to just quickly review what we've been doing today. We basically talked about 3 types of tools that we're using in Excel for data analysis. We began by talking about filtering, and we talked about how when you want to filter data, you simply click on the field called the command at the top called Data, Filter, and you'll see a whole series of drop downs that will appear. If I wanted to find all of Dr. Blake's patients, I could click on my down arrow, select all, select Dr. Blake, and click OK. So what filtering allows me to do is set up my own unique criteria. We also talked about reports, and we talked about how we can create a report using Excel's report writer very easily. The first thing that we need to do is we sort the data. We click Data, Sort. We sort the data, in this case by surgeon, and then I click on Subtotal at each change in surgeon. What is it that I'd like to do? I would like to count the number of cases that each surgeon had. So I put a check mark next to the surgeon, I click OK, and now it tells me that Dr. Blake had 6 cases. Dr. Forrest had 5 cases. Don't forget, you got the small number 1, 2, and 3 over here. If I want to look at just the total, I hit the number 1. If I want to look at the category totals, I hit the number 2. If I want to look at the entire report, I hit the number 3. I can even look at the detail of one doctor and just the summary data of any one, all the others. If I hit the tiny little number 2, and let's suppose I want to see the detail behind Dr. Hernandez's cases, I follow her name over and I see the plus sign at row 22. I hit that little plus and notice what it's doing. It's now showing me the detail data for Dr. Hernandez, but it's also showing me the summary data for all of her colleagues, for all of the other doctors. And then lastly, we did the granddaddy of them all. We did the pivot table, and we began by talking about the difference between a summary table and a detail table. We're looking at detail level information here. If I want to create a summary, if I want to do a count of all these patients by sex and race, I simply click on Insert, Pivot Table. The data will then automatically select based upon the criteria that I've put in. I click OK. I'm now going to take my sex, and I'm going to take that, make that my column label. I'm going to take the race, make that my row label, and I'm going to take the sex and make that the value. And you can see that over on the left-hand side, I can quickly create a very simple pivot table of my data. I can also chart that. I single-click anywhere inside my pivot table. I then click on where it says Pivot Chart. I select the chart type, and then I click OK. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, filtering, subtotals, and pivot tables all represent ways that you can use Microsoft Excel to increase your reach, to do better data analysis, to do more with less, and to be able to work smarter, not harder. I hope that this webinar has been useful for you. If you have any questions or comments, we would really enjoy receiving feedback. We would like to do a number of these sessions, and we'd like them to be as helpful to you as we possibly can. If you have any questions, you can easily reach me to mgera at healthcarepctraining.com. If you have any comments or any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. What we generally do is if we get questions of a common nature, we'll send out a blast to everybody who participated in this webinar, and we'll try to answer questions of a general nature first, but I will try and do my level best to answer individual questions as well. So once again, thank you very much for participating in this webinar. I hope it was helpful to you. I look forward to seeing you again. We'll be doing another one on June 18th where we're going to be talking about reconciling data from multiple data sources. Thank you very much.